All right. Good morning, Dad.
Good morning.
Today is Friday, May 23rd. And what's been on your mind more, the Ukraine stuff or the Gaza stuff these days?
Ah, well, maybe the Ukraine, but it's they those two wars, those two conflicts, yeah, compete for attention within my mind. I mean, there's a lot going on in both places.
Do you ever think about anything else other than these two
No,
conflicts?
no. Well, sometimes about Iran too. Occasionally even about China, but I do think about other things.
I'm just
I'm forced
checking.
to. Your mother wouldn't allow me to think about just these things.
Okay. Well, we won't talk about whatever mom wants you to think about. So let's start with the Ukraine conflict then. So,
Sure.
what can you give us an update? What's going on? I saw a headline on RT News this morning saying that Moscow is at an advanced stage on a memorandum towards some type of peace treaty with Ukraine. What's happening? It feels like we're
Okay.
entering into a
Right.
new phase.
Well, yeah, that was to be expected. There was during the first round of negotiations held in Istanbul, just a short while ago. Um, the two sides agreed to a few things. One was a prisoner exchange, which actually began today, and another was to present each side would present its kind of respective its own requirements for the conditions that would have to be met in order for a ceasefire to go into effect. And that's what that report from RT was about. Okay, I know that the Russians have been working on it, spelling everything out, laying out. Okay, if we're going to have a ceasefire, we first have to meet conditions A, B, C, D. Whatever we have a pretty good idea because what those conditions are because Putin in an earlier speech laid them out, and I think also in a previous phone conversation with Trump. But they're going to spell it out, I guess, in greater detail and present it to the other side.
Can you just give us a quick recap again? What is the points?
Okay, well, yeah. The first would be, yeah, no more a cutoff in military supplies to Ukraine. Okay, the flow of military equipment, ammunition the Ukrainian armed forces would have to cease, and during the ceasefire, and the same goes for intelligence support that would have to cease. And then also there has to be a carefully worked out plan for monitoring the ceasefire. We're talking about a front that's nearly 1,000 miles long, and so you have to have something in place, some monitoring personnel and stations to make sure that the ceasefire isn't violated. And if it is violated, another thing is that you have to have some sort of mechanism to deal with that. I think those are the main things. Maybe I'm forgetting something else, but I think those are the main requirements that the Russians have for a ceasefire. And obviously, the first one about the military equipment and so forth is to prevent Ukraine from using this simply to rearm, because they saw that happen during previous ceasefires. So they say, okay, yeah, you're on the back foot. We're advancing. We're not going to just stop and give you a chance to take a breather, rotate troops, and rearm, and then enter restart the fighting with renewed vigor. We're not going to let that happen. So that's why they have those conditions. And then I think for any ceasefire, yeah, you do have to work out some sort of monitoring system, and you do have to have mechanisms in place to deal with violations, because violations will occur. You don't want to, on the one hand, um, when a violation occurs, you don't say, okay, the ceasefire is over, but how do you deal with it? If the violations are too grave and numerous, of course that can lead to the end of the ceasefire. How do you determine, what is an egregious violation, that is going to require further negotiations or will lead to the end of the ceasefire. But in the case of minor violations, what do we do to prevent those from getting out of hand? Those are all things that need to be worked out.
Do you think that a ceasefire is even viable? Like you said, there's a 1,000 kilometer long front. How can he monitor that? Who would monitor that? How can it
Yeah.
be done impartially?
Well, I think it is possible, but it would actually clearly it would be a major effort, and it would require a large number of personnel, and maybe personnel from the both sides, but also from a third country, maybe that's considered is trusted by both sides. Again, I don't know what that would be. That's what we'll see when the Russians present their list of conditions. But, it is possible. It's very difficult, and I think that that is why that. So Putin is right. We can't just declare a ceasefire. We have, again, it's nearly 1,000 miles, even more than 1,000 kilometers. It's like we can't. If we do that, it's just sure to fail. I think he's absolutely right. If you want this to succeed, you got to work out those, all those matters beforehand. If the ceasefire is going to have a chance. But it could, again, it's a major effort. It's going to require a lot of planning and a lot of resources, but it could be done. Assuming that there's some goodwill or intent to do it on both sides.
Right, and in that condition for the West to not continually arm Ukraine during the ceasefire, do you think that's able to be enforced? Or, I mean, they'll be smuggling things across, or maybe at least will greatly reduce the amount of arms where it's acceptable for Russia?
Yeah, well, that's true. I mean, you can say, right, how do you determine that they're meeting that condition? That's going to be difficult. But perhaps you do have to have, inspectors at certain border crossings, that kind of thing. That's maybe what the Russians would require, because they would expect the Ukrainians in the West to cheat. So you say, well, okay, we got to put some sort of monitoring stations over the western end of Ukraine to make sure that smuggling doesn't take place.
Is there?
Yeah, it would be a huge challenge. It's not impossible. It would be a very difficult challenge to meet, but.
Do you think it will happen?
No, I don't think it will happen. It's just clear that at this point anyway, maybe sometime somewhere down the road it will happen, but at this point it seems like again both the West and the Ukraine want to continue the fight. I think for maybe different reasons they would like to have a ceasefire right now. Maybe I think in the minds of some anyway that this is just kind of a ruse. They know that the Russians will reject it, and then they can say, well, look, okay, the Russians don't want peace. And, that's obviously what they were trying to do. Remember, they had their ultimatum after the Victory Day celebrations in Moscow. But Putin had his emergency, midnight press conference, and then Trump ended up, leaving Team West, where they'd worked out, okay, how we're going to do the ultimatum. We're going to say that a ceasefire in 48 hours. If you don't accept it, we're going to slap you with, severe sanctions. That was the plan. It clearly was. They started saying, but the whole thing fell apart, mainly, I think, because Putin, was quick to respond and present this alternative. And then Trump never really had his heart in the whole ceasefire ultimatum plan. I think maybe he had given people reason to believe that he was on board with it, but then when he saw an alternative, he just clearly distanced himself from the plan and actually embraced Putin's approach, which of course has the West in chaos. Or the whole Western approach has fallen apart. The ultimatum has failed at this point, and the Western leaders are furious.
I mean, if Trump stayed on board, would it have changed really anything? They would have just slapped on more sanctions. Nothing would have really changed, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
right. Again, we've talked about I don't know if anybody knows how many sanctions have been slapped on Russia. Several months ago, it was the figure that was given was 24,311. And surely it's more than that now. So where are we? 26,000. Russia is the most sanctioned country in the world. The second most sanctioned country is Iran. And Russia is, as we know, is doing fine economically. They are not afraid of sanctions. It's just, why would they be after all this? And it's just so silly. They say, well, this 18th package or whatever, this is going to do it. or this is, sanction number 26,785. That's the one that's going to break the camel's back. No, it won't, and the Russians aren't afraid. So that the whole thing is absurd. It really was. But they would prefer this not to happen. I mean, they would rather continue to be on a negotiating track and communicating, especially with the Americans. There have been real benefits to that. We've talked about the chaos of Trump's team, and often how they seem to be working at cross purposes and not achieving anything. But there have been real improvements since the Biden years, and the most obvious one, of course, is the cessation of the ATACMS missile attacks on pre-2014 Russian territory. That is something to be very grateful for. And there is work. I guess it's proceeding very slowly, but there continues to be an effort to normalize relations between the two countries, between the U.S. and Russia. To restaff the embassies. That hasn't. That continues. It's again proceeding very slowly. So I think the Russians would like all that to happen. And the problem with an ultimatum and new sanctions, it would just kind of really take us back to Biden. The same approach, and with the danger of further escalation or like renewed attacks, and then we have all the tension, the possibility the Russians will retaliate in kind. I think there's no way that it would actually work, but it could sabotage relations. It's not like the Russians were going to ever comply with these ultimatums. That's absurd. But it could, again, just sour relations between the U.S. and Russia, which, of course, I think is what the European leaders want.
So the European leaders, they don't want any negotiations. They just say, keep on fighting, don't talk to Putin, don't negotiate, don't give an inch. Do you think one of the reasons they're doing that is that they're afraid if the Ukrainians begin talking more and more to the Russians, that there's a chance that the Russians will eventually be able to turn the Ukrainians on the Western backers, that they'll come to this realization that, hey, these aren't our true enemies. The true enemies are the ones that told us to do this, that said as long as it takes and caused us to lose 1 million people, promised us NATO membership, led us along the primrose path, as John Mearsheimer says. Right. Mm-hmm. Do you think that's part of the reason, and maybe one of the reasons that the Western leaders are afraid of, like, just nobody talk to Putin, don't negotiate, because they've staked everything on this, and then they've gone in so deep.
Yeah, I think that certainly can be a part of it. One thing is, negotiations humanize the Russians. It's easy to, when it's sort of like when you're in a car and you're cursing somebody in the passing lane or whatever for whatever infraction. It's because you don't have to meet the person face to face. But when you meet a person face to face, you realize, oh, these people are human. They're not crazy. They have their perspective. And that's, it's clear that the Europeans and the Ukrainian regime have been trying to dehumanize the Russians. And I think negotiations is, that's one thing that it does. It's, it's more than that. But one thing that it does is that it begins to humanize them again. You're admitting that they are human beings that can be, even if the negotiations don't go anywhere, just the fact that you agreed to sit down with them, it tells everybody that, oh, you actually know that these people, are rational human beings.
Right. Well, you said earlier that with this proposal, with this memorandum and a potential ceasefire, that the problem is that the West and Ukraine still want to fight. That just seems crazy to me. If you're getting pummeled by your opponent, why do you want to continue to fight? I mean, Russia still wants to fight. It's almost like Russia's acting like they're beating this guy, and they say, "Do you still want me to do this? Let's, we can stop." And they say, "No, give me more," and just, and just keeps on pummeling them. That's what it feels like.
Yeah. Well, it's hard to understand. But I think part of what we're seeing is just the refusal on the part of the West, and by the extension Ukraine, to give up on the unipolar moment. I mean, they got in the habit of thinking of Russia as just sort of as um, it's not is no longer a real rival, but again, a gas station masquerading as a country. Just not a country to be taken seriously. We can issue ultimatums to that, and they just got to accept it. And there was a time, like back in the '90s and early 2000s, where that was virtually true. And it just seems like they can't give up on that. I think it wasn't too long ago that Donald Tusk of Poland actually just said it outright. We are the powerful ones, and Russia is weak. And so, and I think that they just can't wrap their minds around what has happened. In this war, that Russia is not that weak, easily abused country to the east, but is a great power, and you need to recognize that and act accordingly. But you just don't see any signs of that. There's no sobering up on the part. It's just like, what was it? Oh, an example, there was a Foreign Policy magazine article. Again, foreign policy is one of the big kind of heavyweight foreign policy publications in the United States, very closely associated with the establishment and the foreign policy establishment in the U.S. But the article's title and its contents were essentially Russia is losing the war. On the basis it's admitted that the Russians were advancing, but of course there's huge losses and the sort of stuff that we're always fed. So this isn't just a tabloid. Again, this is a major establishment publication. And I think it reflects the thinking of a lot of these people. It's just they can't let go of that thinking. And so it's just like, so they continue to act in the same way. They keep on doubling down. It's just that, okay, we haven't done enough. It has to be another sanctions package. We have to send them a new weapon system. Which one? It just seems they don't really have a practical answer, but it's an article of faith with them. And I think, again, this is in great contrast to the Soviet years, the Cold War years, where, the Soviet Union was the enemy, but it was an enemy to be feared and respected. And so, you negotiated with them honestly because you knew, you understood that you couldn't simply issue ultimatums. Nobody would think about doing that back in those days. But now it's just done all the time. It's just the way these people talk. It's just contemptuous. They're completely contemptuous of Russia. And so it's just like, if you don't do this, you're going to get spanked. It's just, again, like Russia is a wayward child and the West is a schoolmarm. This is the way they seem to think. I think they really do. And they just have trouble giving up on this. And I think maybe the only solution, it doesn't matter what Russia says, it seems like it never really penetrates their skulls. But Russia really just has to crush Ukraine in this war. I wish it wasn't that way, but I think that's what we're looking at. They have to actually be crushed, and in crushing Ukraine, with Western support, that the West maybe finally will understand that, okay, we can no longer be contemptuous of these people. We need to respect them, and we need to recognize their concerns and respond to them. We're just not there yet. You just don't even hardly see any signs of that. Outside of a couple of dissident governments, like Slovakia and Hungary, and some dissident political parties in the West. Well, the only place where you see, I guess, a sign of that is maybe in the mind of Donald Trump and a couple of his advisors. But it's just so very inconsistent. It's just sort of like he does seem to be waking up to this fact, but he's still mired in the old way of thinking. Right now he seems to be drifting towards closer to the Russians, but who knows? That's and that is again, that is infuriating the other Western leaders. They see this happening, but Trump's attitude, Trump will really be put to the test when a major Russian offensive is launched. And of course, we're expecting that to happen pretty soon. Again, it's like when the Russian army starts marching to the Dnieper, or maybe marching towards Kiev, or crosses the Dnieper and starts heading towards Nikolaev or something like that. There's going to be, you know, just a tremendous amount of angst and anger and fear, on the Western side, and Trump is going to feel enormous pressures. I don't know if he's really prepared himself for that. I mean, it was going to be tough for him. Like we said, like one of the things that he fears most is an Afghan moment, and being being humiliated by a loss. It would be pinned on him. I think if at this point it very easily could be, especially if he does slow down or cut off supplies of arms and intelligence. Now, again, he did that very briefly, for maybe just a few days, a couple of months ago, right? And I think we're coming to the end of the aid package. Basically, the arms that were allocated under Biden is supposed to run out, I think, within a month or two. And there will be a need for another, support package by the U.S. And, the question that's always in my mind is like, yeah, he doesn't want to pay it. His base doesn't. But if he doesn't, and then shortly thereafter, you just see a true collapse on the Ukrainian lines, everybody will start screaming and say that, this was because of Donald Trump. He lost this war. And that's going to be hard for him to deal with. He may, he may be drifting towards the Russian position now, but that might just cause him to, to return to the old, basically neocon camp and prosecute the war just as before. So he's protected from those charges of causing the defeat of the Ukrainian army.
It's just kind of amazing that the defeat of the Ukrainian army isn't apparent to everybody at this point, that they would still, it's clear that this is over. And just kind of what we're talking about before, we've talked about how the elites and Western leaders have become victim of their own narrative. Just like you said, this foreign policy magazine saying that Russia is on the verge of defeat is just so far from reality. I mean, you can go to Russia, you can talk to people, you can see it. There's clearly this is not founded in anything. But I'm just surprised that they've been able to be a victim of their narrative for so long. Yeah. If you've been following this war, even if you were following mainstream media, you should start to see a pattern that something isn't right here. That, why are they keep on advancing? Why are the Ukrainians having trouble to recruit or whatever it is? Are you kind of surprised that they've been able to fall such victims of their own narratives for so long? Or at this point, it's just a refusal they do know the truth, but they've gone in so deep that they can't just admit it. So they have to create this false reality and inhabit it, even though they know it's a false reality.
Yeah, I'm somewhat surprised. Again, it's just like the propaganda around this war is really extreme. I mean, we saw a lot of polarization and, let's say an information war in domestic politics prior to the Ukraine war. I'm talking about COVID and Russiagate and all that stuff. And, you could go to, again, it seemed clear that these different information spheres were developing, and they had very little in common. Like if you spent your time in one sort of information or news ecosystem, you would have a very different understanding of the world than if you spent time in the other. But all of that actually was looked rather tame or moderate in comparison to what happened after the war broke out in Russia. It's so extreme, and the two sides are so far apart, that sometimes I just wonder, what's the reality? But over time, I think, it's just become increasingly clear what the reality is, and that is that Ukraine is losing, and is losing, with greater and greater rapidity. But people make these, Yeah, it's hard to understand, but it's real. It's just like part of it is that identification of the West, um, the West as, the superior system. Not just more prosperous and more powerful militarily, but morally superior. All those things, it's just sort of part of being a Westerner. And and I guess it's just very, very hard for people to let go. That's becomes a sense of who they are and what makes them good. And so they fight tooth and nail as the reality begins to indicate otherwise. Um, it is quite remarkable but it just shows the power of that kind of that vision and that faith in the West. It's not just an opinion, it is an identity. It's something that's very deeply held. It clearly is, or it would have been abandoned, quite a long time ago. Um, but yeah, it's still there. And I think that it probably can only, I think there's no question again that with every passing day, every passing month, the Russians are gaining the upper hand, um, and we're getting closer and closer to a true collapse. We've seen collapses occur on certain sections of the front line, like in Kursk, for example, that was a true collapse. Um, but it'll eventually become a general collapse. I don't know how far that day is, how far away it is, but I would, if the Russians, where right now it's clear that the Ukrainians are on the back foot, and the Russians are advancing pretty much all along the line, at several points on the line, they're making significant advances. And in fact, if you look at like the daily advances expressed in terms of square kilometers, they're back to where they were pretty much in November, which was their peak last year. They accelerated through much of the year to the very end of 2024. And then there was a slowdown for a few months, but now they're back up to where they were at the end of last year. In November, they're advancing quite a bit faster. You see that's the situation now, but then if the Russians commit another, who knows, 240,000 men, and maybe at different points on the front line, it just seems to me that okay, it's so clear that the Ukrainians are just barely hanging on now. And if it wasn't for the drones, it would already be over. But the drone, their parity or near parity in drones allows them to hang on, but not to. But in the end, they can't hold the line. They're retreating. If that's the situation now, when those 240,000 come in, it's you can. The consequences seem to me to be obvious. That the line is going to break. It's got to really truly break in certain places, and then we're going to see, real obvious advances, and then that's going to change everything. I think the fact that the territorial changes have been slow, and they really have. Even now when we're talking about the faster, more rapid advance, we're still talking about like a decade before, if they continue like at the pace that the Russians continue to advance at the pace that they're advancing right now, it still would take them a decade to get, let's say, all of southern and eastern Ukraine. So that it is slow. It really is, and that allows people who are whose first instinct, of course, is to believe in Western Europe superiority, to seize upon explanations, say, okay, yeah, the Russians are advancing, but they're going real slow and they're suffering huge losses. That's what the Ukrainians told us. And okay, yeah, somehow with maybe gum and duct tape, they've managed to hold their economy together, but it's under huge strains and it's about to collapse. And, these are the explanations that are offered, and they've been offered again and again. It's on the verge of a collapse. They're about to give up. It's clear that they're not really listening to the Russians. They're not really looking very closely to what's happening, but they can seize on these explanations it will be much harder to do that, if there really is a collapse, if there, major breakthroughs and the Russian army just goes marching to the Dnieper. Um, and then we'll have to see. It'll be an interesting moment. What it's sort of like we've been dealing with this mental patient. How will this mental patient deal with this undeniable reality? What are they going to do? They'll start maybe looking for traitors, and maybe the number one traitor will be Donald Trump. We'll see.
Right. Yeah, I want to go back to when you mentioned about just our identity as the Western, hegemon, the superiority that we have. I think that is the root of a large part of this problem that we have. Our whole identity is about being top dog by a mile. That's what America's all about, and all the European leaders have bought into this identity completely. And the Americas are great champion. We are so powerful because we have the United States. But if we lose this Ukraine war, will that identity just be shattered at that point? Will it be over? Because that is what makes America. My whole life it was America is ahead of every other country by a mile, by miles. Not even close. And I believed it. Everybody did. But over time, especially after I lived in China for so long, I just started to realize things were different. And I'm like, hey, something's not quite right here. And then the Ukraine war just blew it open for me. Like, whoa, this whole thing was a lie. It's a paper tiger. Do you think that will be the outcome of this?
Well, I think it potentially could be. I mean, if it doesn't actually destroy this sense of superiority, it's going to severely damage it. I think, again, like people who are outside of it, who are not part of the West, in other words, the global majority, are looking at it and are recognizing, what you're recognizing, that America isn't the colossus, the hyperpower, that we thought it was. And, and it's not just, of course, military, but again, all these things go together. Military power, soft power, which is, a sense of moral supremacy, which I think is actually very, very important. And then economic power. All those things are, maybe those are the three legs that it stands on. And all of them have taken a real beating. And it's, again, mainly it's outside of the West because, we work hard to convince ourselves that everything's normal. But an unequivocal defeat in Ukraine, where it just becomes clear, that where it becomes absolutely undeniable. Right now, there are ways, because the front is moving slowly. The Russian advances are still, they certainly have accelerated. They're certainly much more rapid than they used to be, but you could still describe them as incremental. But if that changes, and I think it's bound to, because these new forces will be committed to the battle. That's what we're all expecting. And then also because, again, the Russians have pushed through the strongest fortified lines of the Ukrainians already. And in some places, there's really nothing, like where the Russians have entered into Dnipropetrovsk, the new oblast. They just did that the other day. There's really nothing there. It's just there aren't any fortifications. It's going to so the combination of new forces and a very different kind of battle environment is going to lead to, I expect, I might be wrong, but I think many of us are expecting a very rapid, a much more rapid advance by the Russians, and that will, I think, inevitably chase away a lot of these illusions. But how they deal with it, again, is just like it's sort of like these people are, I won't say mentally unsound, but it almost seems that way. They're kind of maybe spiritually unsound, it's just this hubris has blinded them, and they've been, behaving in a way that's really self-destructive. And they've been, engaged in just sort of, a denial of reality. But reality eventually always has a way of breaking through. And when it does, we'll find out. We'll find out what they're made of. Will it be Will it be a return to common sense, or will they seize upon some even more far-fetched explanation and behave in an even more reckless manner? Yeah, I think that's going to be a kind of a moment of truth, and it may not be too far in the future.
If when there is just a clear defeat for the Ukrainians, I think a lot of people in America and the West will maybe adopt the attitude. It's like, well, we could beat the Russians, but it just wasn't worth our time. We didn't really try. I think a lot of American military power bros here will have that type of response. How would you respond to that?
Yeah. Well, it's clear that we went all out. And if you stop and look at the things that we've said, of course, over the course of this conflict, each time we introduced a new weapon system, we say, okay, now, we're going to give them our HIMARS, or our small diameter glide bombs, or we know the Abrams tanks. It's one thing after another, and the F-16s. And I remember all the hype that preceded each of these, and there was just a real certainty, or all the hype that preceded the summer offensive of 2023. Because again, that was, we may now try to pretend that, okay, that was the Ukrainians and they messed up. There's an effort to, but these are all NATO operations. These are NATO weapon systems. These are, NATO trained and directed and troops. And they were following a NATO battle plan, and they were being supported by NATO intelligence. And that is, for anybody who wants to actually look at it, that's just a fact. Again, there was that very, very long article in the New York Times. What was it, a month or two ago? That which even the dissidents like us kind of found surprising, the extent of U.S. and NATO involvement in all the Ukrainian operations. It wasn't just strategic or operational; it was actually tactical. It's like, okay, we see something with our satellite here, attack this hill. And that's what they were doing. So, anybody who knows anything, and and maybe that's a small minority, but certainly, like military analysts and people working in the Pentagon, so they know. And it's going to be a real shock to them. And I think maybe they are already kind of experiencing a lot of concern. But will we be able to spend it? Yeah, we're pretty good at that. There have been a lot of disasters, everything from the Iraq War, the Libya intervention, and with these things have ended. These interventions, of course, these are different. We're talking much smaller countries and a direct intervention. They've ended disastrously, but it's amazing how we can just shift the focus, and it's just like, it's just forgotten. That didn't work out. We don't talk about that anymore. And then we go on to the next conflict. I guess what's different about this is it's just not going to work. This was too big. It was is in Europe. And yeah, there will be an effort to kind of to spin it and to pretend that didn't really matter much. But I think that's going to be hard to pull off after all the things that have said, and all the conferences that have been held by the Western leaders, and all the the big talk by and threats from people like Macron and Starmer and so on. I think it's not just a few things they said, but over the course of years they repeated it again and again, and this war has raged, and it's just not going to. If they try to say, let's not talk about this anymore, let's, I don't think they're going to succeed. So, yeah, it may not destroy the sense of Western superiority, but I think it's going to damage it seriously.
When do you think this is all over? Do you think there will even be Ukraine left? Or is there a possibility that it will go like the Yugoslavia route? It could be absorbed by neighboring countries. Obviously, Russia's going to be taking a lot. Maybe Hungary and Poland take a bit, and some new states get created or something like this. Will there be no Ukraine when this is over?
That's a possibility. It's hard to say. Again, another possibility is that the ultranationalists will retreat to their homeland, which is Western Ukraine, with its capital in Lvov. And just entrench themselves there. um, and fight off, all this secessionist movements. It's not just, again, the Russians that are being suppressed, but as you pointed out, like Hungarians and Romanians, there's an effort to suppress their language or the teaching of those languages in schools and so forth. So there is a potential, like you say, for other regions to break away, especially if Ukraine is greatly weakened. Of course, it will be greatly weakened, but I don't know if they'll. Uh, but it still remains unclear whether or not they'll be able to hang on to those regions. I think there is a risk of them losing it. It's true. It just may be that, I say that on one hand, we may have kind of a very unified ultra-nationalist Ukraine in the West, and that is able to hold on to all its territories in the West with Western support. Um, but then we may also just see chaos. And maybe that, there's a possibility of civil war and who knows what that could lead to. And in that chaos, yeah, other regions could break away. But that's all, it's in the distant future, maybe not in terms of time. All those things could happen in a year or two, but it's far removed from the current situation. But again, it's just like if the Russians advance, they cross the Dnieper, then who knows? It's the question is, how is the West going to react to it? How is Ukraine going to react to it? Is there going to be just a stiffening of resolve and a kind of a further rallying around the ultra-nationalist flag there? Or will there be Ukrainians that start to turn on the ultra-nationalists? Right now, we don't see it, but, maybe under extreme pressures that might change.
Okay. All right. Is there anything else important that we should know about the Ukraine war before we move over to the Middle East? Current
Um,
developments.
yeah, maybe I'll just add very quickly that, I've seen different actually interviews of people who are directly involved in drone warfare. One was recommended to me by you, and it's fascinating. Again, it's clear that drones have transformed modern warfare, and it's you can't rely entirely on drones, for the reasons that they're the charges that they deliver are limited. They can't break. They're not able to penetrate. Fortifications, but they can certainly kill soldiers and can disable armored vehicles, and they've become kind of the main source of casualties. Everybody, people have different figures. One I gave, I think, was actually from the Russians that 75% of Russian soldiers were being killed by drones. I've heard 70% from other sources. Yeah, drones are really what it's all about. And anybody who spends time at the front will go back and say, yeah, that's what you were worried about all the time. Like every time you stepped outside, you looked up and yeah, or you listened carefully because there's always a chance that a drone was overhead. And yeah, that was one area where Ukraine really had a lead. The Russians were really unprepared for drone warfare, and that was a serious mistake on their part. Now I know that with the new Minister of Defense, Belousov, like he before he was assigned his position of Minister of Defense, he had really emphasized drones. He understood that this was just a completely essential part of the war, and it's had to be developed. And so I think, especially under his supervision and direction, the Russians have really caught up. I mean, this is what I get the sense from hearing all these different drone operators with direct experience, where that was the one area where they're behind until recently. They were way ahead in these other areas. But that was one area where they were slightly behind, at the beginning, far behind, and then they've been catching up. And now if they haven't moved ahead, they're in the passing lane. That's, I think that's what we're looking at. And it's just, I could do a whole episode on it. It's just like they're all new kinds of drones. We've talked about drones that lay in ambush. We've got these tunnels that are supposed to protect vehicles on supply routes from drones. But what the I guess what both the Russians and the Ukrainians will do is they'll send one drone and punch a hole in that net, and then send another drone through the hole, and then the drone will actually just kind of um, will land on the shoulder of the road and wait there, for a convoy to approach, and then it just jumps up and attacks. This is just one example of the kind of things that are happening. And then you have drones that are intercepting other drones. They're just specialized as being kind of similar to a peregrine falcon that feeds on other birds. This is a drone that goes after other drones. But then to counter that, you have some of these drones now have a camera like in the tail, so when they're being pursued by one of these drones, they can see where that is exactly and take evasive action. The arms race, I've heard, is just like every 2 months there's a kind of a new revolution. It's just incredibly rapid on both sides here, and this is a big part of what's happening in this war.
Right. Yeah. No, I found the drone warfare very interesting. I'll try to remember to link that video that I shared earlier. I think it's definitely worth a watch. But one thing that it talks about is just how Russia and Ukraine are light years ahead of everybody else in terms of drone warfare because of the necessity of what's happening here. And there are American drones, but they're worthless apparently. The Ukrainians don't even use them. They're that bad. So the U.S. is just so far behind in this drone warfare. And another thing that I thought was interesting about it as well is that they're getting to the point now where the people that operate the drones are often like gamers, people with a controller that are just spend all day playing Call of Duty. And now they're given this controller, and they'll actually have somebody that's close to the front that is their avatar almost, that will run out and deploy the drone for them that's close to the battlefield. And they will be sitting in their chair in a place like Moscow where they're comfortable and they're able to, and these guys are experts, they're just super quick, super, fine motor skills that they're training all these people. So it's crazy to think that that's how war is going. You have people that are just sitting there basically playing a game. It is scary because
the consequences are real. You're
the consequences are real, right? Yeah. But for them, it's almost like they're playing. It's like they're playing Call of Duty. So it takes that human aspect out of the war. But the advantage of the drones is that it's very precise, and this is one of the reasons that I think we do overall see quite low civilian casualties in the Ukraine-Russia conflict, is because these are precision weapons. Right. It's not like you're just blasting with artillery or what we see Israel do in terms of how it attacks its enemies, just drop bombs on residential buildings or whatever. Right. These actually can fly into a building and go down hallways or, whatever it is they need to do. Very
These Israelis have those too, but that's secondary. They're interested in, they want to destroy the buildings.
Right. Okay.
But yeah.
Okay, well, I think maybe that's just a good segue to move into Gaza. I want to cover this a bit. So I was just thinking last night, are we entering the stage now where politicians around the world are realizing that they need to be on the right side of history, what's happening in Gaza? That this has gotten so far where we're at the point where people are on BBC News saying 14,000 babies will starve to death in the next 48 hours. We're watching the most documented genocide of all time being unfurling in front of our eyes. We're watching children starve to death in front of our eyes. It gets to a point where all of a sudden there could be this panic amongst all these politicians like, oh, damn, I'm going to be on the side of the person that was part of this genocide. Especially for people that are in the position in the United States, like someone like Donald Trump. You have the ability to stop this at any time. And you can watch, we're watching this in real time. And will you go down in history as the person that was just simply too cowardly to act and allow this to happen, or too incompetent, or too compromised? All of those are terrible things. It's a combination of all three, probably. And then, everybody around the Western world that has been supporting Israel and covering for Israel, they might realize, oh man, we can't do this anymore. We're going to go down as the most pathetic, evil people in history, as to have allowed this to happen.
Yeah. You do see a rising panic, and it probably is based on the realization that, we're on the verge of mass death. It's from starvation. Of course, it's this is just part of the ongoing genocide, but it just becomes so obvious. There's just really no way to spin it. And a lot of the Israelis aren't even trying to spin it. They're quite open about what they're doing. So yeah, that has finally pushed some of these people, who have been just avid supporters of Israel and have condemned anybody who is critical of them, and have very passionately defended Israel from charges of genocide or war crimes and so forth. They're finally saying that, okay, yeah, maybe there's some war crimes here. And I think what the governments of France, the UK, and the third country, maybe it was Germany, I'm not quite sure, but are considering maybe imposing economic sanctions. The UK has broken off some trade talks that they had with Israel. Again, these are governments that have been very, very friendly and very supportive of Israel. Now, so far, it's just taken the form of rhetoric, or, I guess it's a little bit more when you break off the trade negotiations, but we're not actually seeing the imposition of sanctions. There's still, it really isn't anything of substance here, but it maybe that will follow. It's just that there's we've wondered how far Israel could go, but maybe they finally have gone too far. And Israel seems to have realized that too. And so they've actually are letting in some trucks. I heard initially 5, and maybe 2 of those 5 were actually carrying burial shrouds. But then I heard, now we're talking about dozens, but it's still way, way below what is needed. There used to be that 500 would come in every day prior to October 7th. And it's not clear that, even if these trucks had passed, it's not clear, with this new distribution system that the Israelis have set up, whether anything has actually been delivered to the people that need it in Gaza. I may be that I just missed that, but I haven't seen that yet. And it's going to take a lot more. It's going to take a lot more than what they've done. But they just it shows that they actually felt the need to make some kind of gesture. They were starting to feel the heat from their friends, and that's what they're saying openly. People like Netanyahu and Smotrich, it just says, "Hey, we just have to do this. Don't worry, guys. We're still intent on the genocide, ethnic cleansing, but this is something that we have to do to, avoid war crimes charges and keep our friends, in Western Europe and in the U.S. happy."
Yeah, it's I think people should just when I stop and think about it, this population is starving to death. And there's tons of food just waiting outside there in all these trucks. And this isn't food that Israel's providing. The whole world has been providing all these relief organizations and agencies around the world have all these trucks lined up, and Israel just won't let them in. So It's like everybody, it's just so obvious that it's intentional. Right. It's like everybody knows what's happening, right, and everybody wants it to stop. And we're piling up food, and Israel just like, no, okay, we'll let in a couple of trucks in. I think it was Matt Ho that said it was equivalent of something like 2 crackers per person or 4 crackers per person that they've let in for a day. For a population that's starving to death. Babies need baby formula,
right. And it's not at all clear that it's actually going to make it to the people that need it.
Right, and people in northern Gaza apparently aren't getting anything if there's anybody left.
Because it's part of an ethnic cleansing plan. They want to move them out of northern Gaza to a certain part of southern Gaza. And then the intention, the stated intention is then to transfer them to some other country afterwards from southern Gaza. It is a starvation plan in support of ethnic cleansing. That's what it is.
Right.
Either you kill them all with starvation, or use starvation to force them, from their territory to, and thereby achieve, your ethnic cleansing goals.
Right. So, Western politicians, I'm sorry, you're already on the wrong side of history. You can do something by changing your stance now and salvage a little bit what's left of your reputation, but I think it's already too late for these people. We are on the wrong side of history on this, and it will be judged,
Hmm.
throughout throughout time,
Yeah.
as one of the most heinous things that we allow to happen. It's
No, agreed. Yeah.
but do you think that Israel is in the stage now where they are realizing that, the jig might be up, or the jig is going to be up soon, so we got to move faster? Is that what they're in, that stage, that they don't have a choice at this point? Well, of course they have a choice, but they feel they don't have a choice. That
Uh-huh.
we've gone this far, we can't stop now, and we're so close to achieving our goals. We're
Right.
getting so close to killing all of them, but that's so crazy. That's their goal,
Yeah.
to kill them, or just drive them off their land.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah, yeah, yeah. Again, in the case of Netanyahu, that is his goal, and it's. I think he sincerely wants to achieve this. He is a Zionist of the most extreme sort. Yeah, but also he needs to do it to hold together his coalition. Ben Gvir and Smotrich have made it clear that if you actually abandon this ethnic cleansing plan, we're out of here. We're not supporting you. But he's made it clear to them and says, okay, this is just like a tactical um, slowdown, or it's just, this is not, yeah, the plan's going ahead, but in the interests uh, of of ensuring our support from our Western backers, we have to make some short-term minor adjustments. That's what it's. That's what Netanyahu is saying. That's what Smotrich is telling his followers. He said it quite openly. He said, "Don't worry about it, guys. We're going to starve them all. We're going to annihilate them." That's the word that he used. Um, it's just that we have to do this in the short term. It's part of the larger plan. The larger plan has not changed. So yeah, I think that there's no question that Netanyahu is going ahead with it, and he probably also sees that he has to act fast. Probably, so. And then on top of this, the threats against Iran. It just may be that he's fast. He has made commitments that are going to lead to the ethnic cleansing of Gaza, and also to war with Iran. And he's kind of painted himself in a corner. Now he can't really walk away from these commitments because it's part of what keeps him in power.
The fact that it's something that keeps them in power is just a sign of how sick Israeli society is now. It's like that this, you need to continue some type of genocide. You would just hope that if something this horrific was happening in any country, that the people were aware of it. Everybody would rise up and said, "This has to stop now." I think this is
Yeah,
one of the most awful things about this. It's
yeah,
really lifted the veil, and
right,
shown, like, oh my
yeah,
God, this really is a sick society with some really sick ideas.
right,
Um, and we're supporting it. And so
yeah. Well, again, yeah, dissidents, like true dissidents in Israel, like Gideon Levy, has said exactly the same thing. That he finds this actually almost the most depressing aspect of everything that followed October 7th. It's just the lack of any real opposition with Israel. He himself finds it extremely disheartening. Nobody's out there protesting, against the mass starvation policy, in or the genocide in general. Nobody's doing that in Israel. The only thing that they protest against, of course, is Netanyahu's policies vis-a-vis the hostages and the Supreme Court and Shin Bet, their domestic matters. And it's just like these people obviously don't exist to him. And then you get, more and more, this has been true all along, but you get people, government officials. There's an ex-member of the Knesset recently, a surgeon, who who are openly using genocidal language. It's just not hidden. And they may be, they're not condemned. It's obviously they're reflecting something deep within Israeli society. Um, I read something, I can think it was just yesterday. It was of course, there are some Palestinians who are Israeli citizens. Approximately 20% of of Israel's population is Palestinian. And this one Palestinian doctor, he worked at a hospital that has both, it serves a mixed Jewish Palestinian population. And he just remembers, it was actually towards the beginning of the war, or I don't think we should dignify it with the word war, but of the genocide, when after different hospitals had been bombed by Israel, these hospital bombings were being celebrated by these doctors, and he just found that just so, again, shocking. I thought, okay, well, we're professionals. We're all devoted to our devotion to our profession should actually extend across, ethnic and national lines, and how can we ever support the bombing of a hospital? But they were celebrating the bombing of a hospital, and that's it. Just seems like there's just it's a very, very small example, but it just lets you know like the extent. It's not just that there are a few extremists, a few fire-breathing extremists on the right, and then if we get rid of them, we're okay. No, this is something that just extends throughout Israeli society, and is deeply rooted in Israeli society.
A society that has those types of beliefs can't survive long term, right? I mean,
I sure hope not.
but what does that mean? I mean, what does that mean that these people have all of a sudden, as Biden said, a come to Jesus moment? Or do they go back to their home, original countries, from their ancestral homes? I mean, what happens? I mean,
Yeah. Well, yeah, we'll find out, how real this come to Jesus moment is. I think clearly people like Chuck Schumer and Piers Morgan, those are some of the more notable examples. They have found that they're very uncomfortable with the association between themselves and the Israeli government and its current policies right now, and they do want to put some distance. Now, we'll see how significant this is. It has, it could indicate a sea change, or it could be just like in the case of Netanyahu, just a tactical move. Is it that like, okay, yeah, this is looking bad. We got to, we need to say this, express this concern. But when, the Israelis, they let in 5 trucks, will say, okay, look, the Israelis are doing what they can. And they're just back to, they're satisfied with the really rather meaningless measures that the Israelis take. Will they be satisfied with those meaningless measures? If they are, then we know that it's not real, right? But if they continue to put on the pressure, and if actual real sanctions are imposed, then we can say that something has really changed, that maybe we are seeing the beginnings of a sea change. You're frozen right now.
sorry, Dad, I lost internet. I hope I didn't lose our conversation. But where were you?
I was talking about these people that have had, apparently have had a come to Jesus moment. I'm talking about people like Chuck Schumer and Piers Morgan, who have finally acknowledged, that there is something. They're not quite using the word genocide, but, acknowledging there's something at least like a war crime, being committed by the Israelis right now, and are asking the Israelis to stop this mass starvation. That could be very significant. It could signify a true sea change in true softening or breaking apart of the support that Israel has relied on for so long and has made their war crimes possible. Let's hope that that's true. But we'll find out. The other possibility is that we're seeing something that's just tactical on the part of these people, similar to what Netanyahu is doing by letting in a few trucks. It's just like, okay, yeah, we haven't changed our objective of ethnic cleansing, of mass death and so forth. But just so that, we can firm up or protect our the support, or that very important support that we receive from the West, we need to make these temporary and really rather meaningless changes, these minor adjustments. And we'll see if these people like Piers Morgan, if they're just satisfied with these minor adjustments, and they say, okay, yeah, the Israelis are trying to do their best and start making excuses for them again, then we'll know that it didn't really mean anything, that it was just kind of tactical on their part too. But if they actually press ahead, continue with their, very sharp criticism, of Israel, and more than that, if they support actual sanctions on Israel, then we know that there has been a real change, of heart on their part. We're not there yet, but that's something to look for. Yeah, we'll see if it's real or not.
Okay, last question. What do you make of these two Israeli diplomats that were assassinated or killed outside the Jewish Museum in DC?
Yeah, it's obviously a tragedy. I think there's no way that can be justified. It was, I understand that the gunman shouted "Free, free Palestine," I think immediately after he shot them. So it was a, a killing carried out in his own mind in support of Palestine. But he has not done Palestine any good. I mean, that's the fact. This is going to strengthen the hand of the Zionists, especially within the United States. And it's going to, mean that like the effort to round up Palestine supporters among graduate students, for example, that effort will intensify. It's a terrible thing that happened. But what we can see, I mean, I'm not in any way justifying it, but things like this will happen, because there is a genocide going on and people are being pushed to the breaking point and beyond. So we had, for example, what was it, Aaron Bushnell, better than a year ago, set himself afire, self-immolated and died for Palestine. He couldn't take it. And I think just a couple months earlier, there was a young woman who did something similar. I think she survived, but she was critically injured. So we are seeing these kind of things happen. And, I wouldn't advise anybody to do any of these things, but, most definitely, you can say that, like in the case of Aaron Bushnell, it, you could argue, again, I wouldn't advise anybody to do this. I think it's wrong, but you could argue that it actually does strengthen, it does help the Palestinian cause. But certainly these killings do not. They're unjustified, and they actually strengthen the Zionists.
I don't even know if I should go here, but the internet is, a lot of people seem to be very suspicious about these killings. People say things like false flags. Nobody's seen any, as far as I know, any videos or photos of actually any bodies or the killings. There's just the footage afterwards saying "Free, free Palestine," and then the idea is that the starvation campaign in Gaza was getting so extreme to pivot the story over to the narrative over to anti-Semitism and how these people are being gunned down simply for being Jewish. That's what's being put out there. I was watching the news yesterday. BBC News had a long coverage, and they're talking about there's just the rise in anti-Semitism. They had the Anti-Defamation League on there. All these things, lots of pieces going on about this. They're really. And you just see on Twitter every single congressman and politician condemning it. And obviously, if a murder is a murder, it's a horrific act. But some people find that suspicious. How the timing of it. Do you think that should we even entertain that possibility, or it's not even something that you want to touch?
Yeah, well, it clearly benefits Israel. It clearly benefits the Zionists. I find that highly doubtful. I guess I've learned not to be just entirely dismissive if there's some really solid evidence that comes forward. But it seems like, how can you hide this? If these people, indeed existed and they were killed, I don't think that's a fact that you can hide. I don't see how it could be hidden. So I find it very hard to believe that it was a false flag.
I just find it kind of weird that when assassinations or murders happen, I'm just thinking of like the Luigi guy with the CEO of the large health insurance companies. I forget what it's called, but we have footage of that. People see it, and or there's the bodies. These things aren't usually that hidden, and I feel like if you're in the middle of DC, in the front of a museum, I'm just surprised that we haven't seen anything, before or after. Simply
Yeah.
just that
Yeah. Well,
shot.
I'm assuming that we will, that, and if some information, if no evidence is ever presented, then then I think you'd have a true, you would be well justified in questioning it. That should be part of any sort of investigation, inquest. It's like the bodies have to be examined and whatever. And if we get some sort of credible information that didn't happen, then okay, yeah, maybe. Again, it clearly is to the benefit of Israel and its supporters. But I think it's much too early to jump to those kind of conclusions.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
I know we should just. That's why I was hesitant to even bring it up. I'm like, I know we should wait, but it's easy to get sucked down in these things and start thinking like, well,
Well,
and I know
on the
I
other
should,
hand,
so.
I find it believable that somebody cracked and he just got so angry that he just said, I'm going to, shoot these. Yeah, I don't know if he knew them, if he knew that they were connected with the embassy or not, or if they were just Jewish. But one way or another, in his mind, he felt like, these people are doing such terrible things, and I just have to, I have to do something, and it can't go on. Again, it's wrong, it's unjustified. In the end, it's terribly counterproductive. But I think, again, we've been talking about this genocide and how horrible it is and how it's just like, this can't go on. And there are a lot of people that are really are having trouble sleeping at night thinking about this. And some people who have psychological conditions, maybe can just go off the deep end and do something like this. I don't find that at all unbelievable. I think that's probably what happened.
Right. The frustrating thing is when I watch a lot of the news coverage over this incident, they talk about it as if these people were gunned down simply for being Jewish, instead of focusing on the fact that they are Israeli diplomats, that they are representing a government that is engaged in what is genocide. It's becoming clearer and clearer to people as genocide. Instead, it's like, no, they were gunned down for their Jewishness, which is just, it's just such a frustrating distortion of the reality. It's like, no, talk about the fact that they were Israeli, not that they were Jews.
Yeah.
It's
now,
like, that's
we don't know. He may have not known that they were Israelis. It was the Jewish Museum. We just don't know at this point. But even if they were gunned down because they were Jewish, it was because Jewishness and genocide have become inextricably linked in the minds of many people. Now, that may be unfair, but it just is obviously happening. And the problem is not just anti-Semitism or, bad anti-Semites out there. The problem is the genocide. And if you are genuinely concerned about the rise of anti-Semitism and the genocide, be a brave person like, Max Blumenthal or Glenn Greenwald or, Norman Finkelstein, Jews that are just unequivocally opposed to this genocide and have been spoken very, very bravely against it. They're the most powerful. They're fighting anti-Semitism, but people who are trying to make excuses for Israel, who are, clearly, providing cover for Israel, like so many people in the media, no, they're creating a possibility anyway of a real rising anti-Semitism, because human beings, what they, who they are, they don't, they make these associations, or they put too much weight on these associations, but the association is real. It's a Jewish state committing genocide. So yeah, no, that's wrong. There are very brave Jews that are opposing it. You shouldn't, and a murder is murder. It doesn't matter. But this is going to happen. And if you're afraid you don't want more incidents to occur, you should be fighting this genocide. if anti-Semitism is something that really, really frightens you, you should be fighting this genocide.
Amen. Okay, Dad. Well, let's end it there.
Okay.
Okay. Have a good day and a great weekend. All right.
You
Bye-bye.
too. Bye-bye.